Beneath the glow of the crystal chandelier, which cast intricate reflections upon the glasses of sparkling wine, my father raised a toast to me. Yet, his smile felt fake, strained, and unnatural. Leaning closer so his words wouldn't reach other ears, he whispered, "To my billionaire son." His voice was sinister, like a snake's hiss. A sneer bared his teeth, but his eyes remained cold and expressionless. My heart clenched with a sense of dread, but I gathered my resolve, returned his smile, and clinked glasses with him. For a moment I almost believed his sincerity. But when his gaze drifted, I noticed strange cloudy streaks dissolving in the golden liquid. My throat went dry with horror. He intended for me to drink this. He wanted me to swallow this toast, unquestioning and unsuspecting. I made my decision. With a steady hand, despite my wildly pounding heart, I subtly switched our glasses. He raised his glass again, smug and confident in his scheme's success, and took a large gulp. 45 minutes later, the mansion filled with my father's hoarse, ragged breaths. His hand convulsively gripped mine as his face turned canvas white. The laughter and merriment died down, and trembling lips uttered words he had held within for decades. He confessed everything to me before he died. I should have known this evening would never be just a celebration. At first glance, it was an evening many only dream of. The Weiler estate sparkled like a fairy tale palace, surrounded by twinkling lights reflected in the glittering snow on the lawns. Inside, music played, guests danced, and crystal glasses clinked in honor of another year of power and prosperity. Faces shone with smiles, people laughed and embraced, as if nothing in the world could shatter this illusion of well-being. But beneath the chandelier's glow and the clinking glasses, I felt an oppressive weight. It wasn't merely the burden of being Marcus Weiler's son. It was the realization that my family had never been what it seemed. I, Ethan Weiler, 28 years old, heir to a fortune most people couldn't even imagine. From the outside, it appeared I had everything: wealth, influence, opportunities. I was called lucky, blessed by fate, even chosen. But no one understood that money doesn't guarantee safety, and power doesn't bring love. In my family, these things had become dangerous weapons. My mother, Clara, stood by the piano that evening, gracing guests with a welcoming smile worthy of an experienced hostess. Her long dress shimmered with gold, and her eyes occasionally searched anxiously for my father, as if she were trying to gauge his mood before allowing herself to relax. She was polite to everyone, always finding a kind word for each person, but with me, she remained distant. I knew she loved me, but she lived in the shadow of my father's control. Over the years, she had learned to survive by remaining silent. That's how she protected us, or at least, that's what she convinced herself. My sister Sophie was entirely different. At 24, she was full of life and naive faith, still clinging to the idea that our father was a great man. She was constantly by his side, laughing at his biting jokes, defending him when others whispered behind his back. She was innocent in a way I never could be. I envied her for it, even understanding that her devotion blinded her. And then there was Uncle Julian, my mother's brother. He kept to the shadows, always half hidden in groups of conversing guests, but never straying far from his glass of whiskey. He had revolved around our family for decades, working with my father, profiting from his deals, but never becoming a full part of the empire Marcus built. Hunger was etched in his eyes, a resentment he tried in vain to conceal behind feigned humor. I had seen it often enough to know he wanted more than my father ever allowed him. This evening was supposed to be a New Year's celebration, a welcoming of the future. Guests raised glasses to success, to health, to family. But as I moved through the crowd of elegantly dressed strangers, shaking hands and exchanging meaningless pleasantries, I felt something else in the air. My father's presence weighed on me like an approaching storm. Marcus Weiler was a man who effortlessly dominated any social gathering. At 56, he maintained a straight posture, his voice cut through the din of conversation, and his gaze was sharp enough to silence anyone who dared challenge him. To the guests, he was charming and brilliant, a man who had built an empire from nothing. To me, he was unpredictable. One moment he could be generous, the next, ruthless. Since childhood, I had learned that his love was conditional, dependent on how useful I was in maintaining his image and fulfilling his plans. That night, his attention was fixed on me more than ever. He moved through the crowd like a predator stalking its prey, and I was that prey. I felt his gaze even when he wasn't looking directly at me. Every smile he offered seemed to be directed at others, but every pause, every sip of champagne felt like part of a meticulously planned performance meant only for me. As the music swelled and laughter filled the hall, I tried to ward off the anxiety. Perhaps it was just my imagination, the pressure of expectations, the constant burden of being Marcus Weiler's son. But then he called my name. His voice was even, firm, and unequivocal. "Ethan," he said, raising his glass toward me, "this evening is dedicated to you." The people around us turned. My heart pounded as he continued, "You are the future of this family. You are the one who will carry on everything I have built." His smile was wide, his words generous, but a dark fire burned in his eyes. Sophie clapped her hands gleefully, her face radiant with genuine pride. "See, Ethan, Father believes in you. This is your moment," she exclaimed. I forced a semblance of a smile, though inside I was cold. This wasn't pride, not support, but something else, something cunningly planned. Father had always been skilled at artfully masking threats with praise and disguising commands as compliments. Since childhood, I had watched him employ this tactic in business negotiations, family disputes, and even in interactions with casual acquaintances. To most, it appeared as self-assurance, but to me, it was always a manifestation of boundless control. In that moment, in the dazzling light of the chandelier, I felt the space around me constrict. The laughter, the music, the clinking of crystal glasses, it all merged into an indistinguishable hum. Only my father's voice cut clearly through the noise. "To my billionaire son," he whispered, leaning close enough for only me to hear. A shiver ran down my spine at his words. In that instant, as our glasses touched, I understood with inexplicable certainty that this night was not a celebration, but a fight for survival. The toast, it seemed, should have ended with a simple clink of glasses and a sip of sparkling wine. But when my father raised his glass higher, I noticed something strange at the bottom of the golden liquid. A barely perceptible ripple spread in circles, like smoke dissolving in water. It happened quickly, almost imperceptibly, but I had no doubt about what I saw. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. Perhaps the play of light from the chandelier or the champagne bubbles had deceived me. But then he slightly rotated the glass, and I saw it again, an unnatural swirl of something mixing with the drink. My stomach lurched, and every cell in my body screamed danger. I looked at my father, trying to maintain an impassive expression. His smile was fixed, sharp, and somewhat predatory, but his eyes betrayed his true intentions. It was not the look of a proud father rejoicing in his son's success, but the gaze of a man eagerly anticipating the outcome. Memories flooded back of times when my father effortlessly destroyed his enemies, using only charm and cunning. He could invite a business partner to a dinner party, offer a toast, and the next morning that partner's empire would be ruined and swallowed by ours. My father didn't believe in accidental victories. He believed in absolute control and achieved it at any cost. My mother stood at the other end of the room, casually conversing with a group of guests. For a moment, our eyes met, and I almost called out to her to show her what I had seen. But she immediately looked away, pretending not to notice what was happening. Such was her tactic. When something went wrong, she preferred to turn away and convince herself that everything was fine. Sophie, still blind to my father's dark side, raised her glass and exclaimed enthusiastically, "To Ethan! To the one who will lead our family into a bright future." She genuinely believed every word, believed that her father was exactly the man she wanted him to be. And Uncle Julian, standing in the corner, watched the scene with his quiet, hungry eyes. He silently raised his whiskey glass in my direction. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was heavier than any words. I looked again at the champagne in my hand, then at the glass my father still held high. If I drank, I would put my life in his hands. If I refused, I would show distrust, and everyone present would understand that I didn't trust him. Either way, I would lose. "Drink, Ethan," my father said in an even, authoritative voice. "It's tradition. Such a toast must be honored." The room erupted in applause. Dozens of eyes were fixed on me, awaiting my decision. I felt the weight of those gazes like shackles binding me. Slowly raising my glass, I felt my hand tremble and hoped no one noticed. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Was I paranoid? Could I truly believe that my own father was capable of poisoning me? Perhaps he had put something harmless in it. Vitamins, for example? Or was this some absurd test? Maybe I was creating a nightmare out of nothing, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Marcus Weiler never acted rashly. If he had put something in that glass, he did it intentionally. My chest tightened. If I drank, I would never know the truth until it was too late. If I refused, I would never be safe again. I forced a laugh, trying to hide my inner turmoil. Tilting my glass, I moved closer to him, proclaiming loudly enough to catch the attention of those present, "To the Weiler legacy." The clinking of crystal filled the air, and at that moment, as I lowered my glass, I made my decision. With a practiced movement that concealed my doubts, I exchanged our glasses. He didn't notice, nor did anyone else. My hand returned with the poisoned drink, which was now in his possession. He smirked, proud of his apparent victory. Raising his glass, he took a deep gulp, while the crowd erupted in applause, mistaking the scene for a touching family moment. Only I knew the true nature of what was happening. My heart pounded furiously, threatening to burst from my chest. I forced myself to smile, clinking glasses with Sophie, but everything had changed. My father's fate had turned against him, and there was no turning back. Time stretched agonizingly slow. The party continued, but I merely reacted mechanically, unable to tear my gaze from my father. At first, he seemed unshaken, but gradually, signs of distress appeared, sweat on his face, an unsteady posture, a strained smile. He loosened his tie and reached for another drink, but his hand trembled. My plan had worked, but the sight of his agony stirred conflicting emotions within me. He was my father, the man who had raised me, tormented me, and shaped my personality. Now, I watched him crumble under the weight of his own intrigues. The laughter in the hall sounded unnatural, the chandeliers seemed too bright, and the music deafening. Every second brought me closer to understanding the consequences of my choice. The decision I made brought unpredictable consequences. The glass exchange was an instinctive act, born of fear and a will to survive. Now, watching the unfolding events, I fully grasped the gravity of what I had done. The music swelled, violins filled the space, and couples whirled in dance. My sister Sophie, oblivious to what was happening, pulled me into a crowd of relatives and friends. I still saw the champagne, now in my father's glass. At first, nothing happened, and for a moment, doubt crept in. But then I noticed a tremor in his hand as he set the glass down. Soon, his face reddened, he loosened his tie, and began to laugh louder, trying to conceal his condition. I watched his every move, realizing that my plan had worked. My pulse quickened, and a wave of guilt squeezed my chest. He was my father, however cruel and manipulative he had been, and I had just delivered his sentence. The festive atmosphere instantly gave way to chaos and confusion. The recent laughter and clinking of glasses were replaced by frozen faces, wide eyes, and anxious whispers. My father, Marcus, lay on the floor, his body convulsing, his face deathly pale and covered in sweat. I knelt beside him, his hand convulsively gripping mine with a strength that seemed impossible for a man on the verge of death. My mother desperately pressed her palm to his chest, begging him to hold on. Sophie, my sister, clung to his other hand, her sobs piercing the silence that had fallen between the horror-filled voices. Julian, my uncle, watched from nearby, his expression unreadable, as if he were a detached observer of the unfolding tragedy, and the glass of whiskey in his hand seemed an incongruous prop in this grim scene. Weak, raspy sounds escaped Marcus's lips. I leaned closer, his breath hot on my ear. "It was him," he whispered with difficulty. "He wanted you gone. He craved everything." His grip tightened, forcing me to focus on every broken word. I couldn't let him take everything dear to me. A chill ran down my spine. I knew who he was talking about. Julian, my own uncle, stood just a few feet away, watching life drain from my father's body, and in his eyes, something akin to sinister satisfaction flickered. Our gazes met, his sharp and unyielding, as if he were challenging me. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to shout his name, to expose him here and now. But the weight of my father's last words compelled me to remain silent. It wasn't just about Julian. It was about something much larger, a sinister secret shrouding our family. A sudden coughing fit racked Marcus's body, crimson blood stained the corners of his lips. A desperate cry for help escaped my mother's lips, her voice filled with unconcealed panic. Someone rushed to call an ambulance, but deep down I knew time was irrevocably lost. The last convulsion passed through my father's body, and with a guttural moan, he pulled me close. "There are things you do not know," he whispered, each word a struggle. "Accidents." None of them were accidental. I personally took care of it. Business partners, rivals, even family members, they all stood in my way. I had to protect what was mine at any cost. His confession stunned me like a clap of thunder. Every inexplicable tragedy, every sudden death, every deal that brought him exorbitant profit, it was all his doing. The vast empire I was to inherit was built on a foundation of betrayal, destruction, and lives taken without the slightest remorse. "You naively believe you are now free," he rasped, his voice barely audible, "but that is far from the truth. They will come for you. He will come for you." His gaze darted towards Julian again, and the meaning of those words became crystal clear. "Don't trust anyone, not even your own blood." My heart pounded wildly in my chest, my breath caught. I wanted to pull away, to shake off the burden of his words, but I couldn't move. I was as if chained to his confession, forced to listen to the horrifying truth about the man I called my father. Sophie desperately shook his shoulder, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Dad, please stop talking. You need to save your strength. Everything will be fine." Her voice held a desperate hope, clinging to a lie that was crumbling with every passing second, but Marcus paid her no mind. His gaze remained fixed on me, burning with the last flicker of life. "Forgive me," he whispered. His grip loosened, his body shuddered one last time, and then he fell silent. An ominous quiet descended upon the room. There was no music, no whispers, no movement. Only my mother's muffled sobs and Sophie's desperate cries broke the ringing emptiness. I stared at his motionless body, my chest tight, my mind frantically searching for an exit. My father was dead. Not from a sudden illness, not from the glass of champagne he had planned to raise for me, but from the poison of his own lies turned against himself, and with his death, he unleashed a torrent of secrets that now belonged to me. Julian finally stepped forward, deliberately placing his glass on the table. His voice, like a blade, cut through the silence. "It seems the great Marcus Weiler has left us." His words were laced with icy sarcasm, and his tone held something akin to satisfaction. What a tragedy. Slowly rising to my feet, I felt my entire body tremble. My father's last words echoed in my head. Now, all eyes were on me. The heir, the son, the man who had just witnessed his father's confession to crimes, capable of destroying everything he had built. Julian's piercing gaze seemed to urge me to speak, to reveal what I had heard. My throat tightened with a spasm, but I remained silent. If I exposed him now, chaos would erupt. If I stayed silent, the truth would fester in the shadows. My mother, clinging to Sophie, whispered prayers through her sobs. Guests began to nervously shift their weight. Some hastily left the estate, others remained to whisper about the unfolding drama. The empire my father had built was already beginning to crumble in the minds of those who had once idolized him. I turned again to his lifeless face, searching for answers in his stillness. But only the burden of his confession remained, and the realization that the battle was just beginning. He had dedicated his life to building a crystal castle, sharp and beautiful, but fragile at its core. And in his last moments, he handed me its shards. The climax was not his death. It was the truth he left behind, a truth that would either destroy me or make me stronger. The arriving paramedics pronounced him dead. By the time the doctors could push through the crowd of frightened guests, my father's body was already cold. His chest was still, his skin pale and clammy with sweat. The medics, after checking his pulse, exchanged grim glances and covered him with a white sheet. That piece of fabric became the line dividing who he was to the world and who he became in that tragic moment. Another powerful man fallen, his empire suddenly as fragile as a house of cards. Guests, bundled in expensive coats, hastily left the estate, exchanging whispers and casting sympathetic glances my way. Some mumbled prayers, others speculated. I caught snippets of phrases: drank too much, weak heart, a disgrace to the whole family. They needed a story that would allow them to sleep soundly. None of them wanted to know the truth. Inside the house, the silence pressed down like an unbearable weight. My mother, sitting on the grand staircase, nervously fiddled with the hem of her dress, her eyes empty and vacant. Sophie, kneeling by my father's body, wept inconsolably, repeating like a mantra, "Everything was fine. He was okay." I stood aside, as if petrified. His last words echoed in my head, "Forgive me. Don't trust anyone, not even your own blood." These words, like snakes, coiled into a tight knot, squeezing my throat tighter with each passing moment. He had left me not only a vast fortune, but also a heavy burden, a poisoned inheritance of secrets and intrigues. Julian was the only one who remained unperturbed. He stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his face impenetrable. His gaze, lingering on me, was filled with some unspoken meaning. A slight nod of his head spoke more than any words. There was no sympathy in it. It was a warning. Late into the night, as the noisy gathering of guests left the family estate, plunging it into ringing silence, the heir to a vast fortune, Ethan Weiler, succumbed to solitude, wandering aimlessly through the deserted halls. The crystal chandeliers, which had recently sparkled with light and reflected joy, now seemed dim and lifeless. The resounding laughter that had filled the space had faded, leaving behind only an oppressive emptiness. The ancestral home, usually radiating grandeur and prosperity, now resembled a mausoleum, burdened by the ghosts of the past, invisible yet palpable in every corner. Ethan involuntarily stopped before his father's study door, a room he had carefully avoided since childhood. The walls were lined with bookshelves, yet the books served merely as decoration, carefully chosen to create a certain impression rather than for reading and reflection. The true heart of the study was the massive desk. Ethan ran his hand over its polished surface, recalling countless hours spent on the other side, when he, still a boy, listened to the instructions of a man convinced of his boundless power over his fate and soul. Now that man was gone, and the empire he had created passed into Ethan's hands. However, this brought no sense of triumph. Rather, it felt like a heavy sentence. The truth he had learned proved to be an unbearable burden, eclipsing the billions in bank accounts. His father had confessed to orchestrating murders, to destroying human lives, to ruthlessly eliminating anyone who dared to stand in his way. He had built his fortune on blood and deceit, skillfully disguised as genius and foresight, and now this sinister legacy was passed to Ethan. He thought of Sophie, the woman who still believed in his father's greatness, blinded by the carefully constructed image he had created. Would she ever forgive Ethan if she learned the truth he had heard? Would he have the heart to shatter her faith in their father? Then he remembered his mother, her years of silence, her conscious choice to turn away from what was happening instead of fighting for justice. Did she know more than she let on? Did she choose comfort over conscience? And finally, Julian. His father's dying words pointed to him as the one seeking Ethan's demise. A shiver ran down his spine at the thought. The man who had toasted his health with a smug smile could have been involved in the poisoning attempt, orchestrated by his father. If this were true, Marcus's death was merely the beginning of a series of tragic events. Ethan spent long hours in the study, contemplating the fate of the empire he was about to lead. The weight of this responsibility pressed down on him, causing physical pain in his shoulders. It was then that he realized wealth was not freedom, but shackles. Billions did not bestow omnipotence, but turned one into a target. At dawn, Ethan stood by the grand windows of the estate, watching the first rays of sun illuminate the snow-covered expanse. His face was reflected in the glass, but he barely recognized himself. He was no longer just Ethan Weiler, the son of an influential man. He had become the heir to his sins. The moment beneath the chandelier, when his father whispered, "To my billionaire son," flashed in his memory. Those words turned out not to be a blessing, but a curse. His father had tried to bind him to his legacy, to drag him into a vicious cycle of greed and destruction. But his own poison had silenced him forever. Yet, the truth remained. His father was gone, but his shadow stretched further than ever. His enemies were still out there, biding their time. His crimes now rested on Ethan's shoulders. His father's empire would be a test for him, either breaking him or turning him into a semblance of his father if he allowed it to happen. That night, Ethan learned one important lesson. Wealth means nothing when it's poisoned by fear, and family loses its meaning when trust becomes a weapon. With the first rays of sun illuminating the estate, he whispered the only vow he could make. He would not become his father. He would not let his secrets control him. But he also understood that the fight had just begun. Marcus Weiler's death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of Ethan's new chapter. He inherited not only his father's fortune, but also his enemies, who would not be slow to act. That night changed everything. His father's death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of Ethan's story. He inherited his wealth, but more than that, he inherited the truth and the enemies who still lingered in the shadows. From that day forward, he carried the burden of his choice, and he knew that the fight for his future had only just begun.